There you go. Good day, Dr. Mike. How are you doing? Good to see you in a chair, really, not in a car.
I'm not in a car, thank God.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me
you
on.
got
Sorry about that,
you got
man.
me you got me a little worried there. But everything went fine?
Yeah, I did not get into a car accident. I will say I had to pick up some friends from the airport and drive a little bit around after, and I saw
Right.
3 car accidents that day.
Yeah, I
So
recall you were just driving and so on, and I was like, oh man, I don't know if we should be doing this.
it was really strange. But soy listo, or is it redundant to say soy listo? Is it just listo?
It's never redundant, man.
Oh, okay.
I think it's the first time I heard you in Spanish, or maybe the second. It's good Spanish, let me say.
Never good Spanish. Yeah, I think I tengo COVID. So,
Oh, really? Damn, you having symptoms?
t- yeah.
Damn, sorry to hear this,
No,
but the
that's okay.
symptoms are it's pretty
It's
they're pretty weird. Some people don't feel it, some people feel like trash.
yeah. I just have a cold. It just feels like a cold. I mean, so.
Man, so thanks for taking the time, especially with a cold.
Oh, no
Hope it's not
worries.
hope it's not COVID.
Well, yeah, whatever. So I'm good to go.
Very well. So periodization, it got a little bit complicated last time we tried to speak about this. But I wanted to begin the topic at hand with just definitions because I know it can be a little confusing to some people. That periodization, as the definition I have in hand by Bufford, it's the planned manipulation of training variables in order to maximize training adaptations and to prevent the onset of overtraining syndrome. But the question for you, Dr. Mike, isn't that all of training? What would be the difference between periodization and just programming? Is it just the time curves? I don't know if I'm
You
being clear.
you are. So
Sure.
I think that's a good um, definition of periodization. I don't think it's the best, most inclusive definition of periodization. I would say periodization, the definition that I learned and that I use formally in my work is periodization is a manipulation of training variables such that you accomplish 3 things. One is an enhanced rate of gains. Another is a reduction in the potential for injury. And the third is a peaking of performance such that when you need to be at your best in any respective qualities, you are at your best at around that time. It's like it's really cool to be getting more jacked all the time, but if you can't step on stage as a bodybuilder and look ripped and jacked at the same time on Saturday morning at 11:20 a.m., then it doesn't
Right.
kind of really matter if you're at a high enough level because then you don't win the show and people say, "How did you do at your show?" And you said, "Well, I didn't do that great." And they look at you and they're, "Well, you're really big and ripped. What happened?" Well, I missed 1/3 of the definition of periodization. Right?
I screwed up a little bit there.
Yeah, and so periodization is the entire thing. Right? The entire training process is periodization. Right? It's just another term for the training process.
Right. Do you think it's safe to say that periodization goes beyond the microcycle and programming stays within the microcycle?
Uh, I'd say programming stays within the mesocycle.
The
Yeah.
mesocycle?
That's
So when we talk about periodization, we begin about talking about training blocks.
periodization is all of the stuff, and
Right.
programming is probably most of the stuff that leads to the mesocycle, and that's it. I would even say it doesn't even lead through the deload because somebody could ask, how do you program your deload? And that means there's very different programming for a deload than there is for an accumulation phase. And so programming is usually very
Uh,
simple and to accomplish really just kind of one thing to move training variables this way and that way within a single, very, very easily defined unitary phase. And then, I don't think you would say, how do you periodize deloads? You could say that, but that would be asking a more grand question of where do you place deloads versus
right.
what do you do during the deload itself. So programming is always kind of zoomed in nitty gritty, whereas periodization includes programming. So it's also zoomed in nitty gritty and includes the overarching structure of what's going on.
Very well. And in regards to periodization, now that we defined it, what would be the benefit specifically for hypertrophy? Because we know by the research that it's beneficial for strength, for power, but what about hypertrophy and most specifically bodybuilding? Because like you mentioned previously, we start to talk about also nutrition, about body composition, that we're not picking for performance. We're picking for a certain look that
Yeah.
takes into account nutritional status and other factors. So what about hypertrophy and periodization?
Yeah. So probably every sort of sport or pursuit can have a periodization because any sport or pursuit requires trying to get as good as possible at. Any sport or pursuit requires the minimization of injury risk. And any sport or pursuit requires the peaking for specific times to make sure performance is right on the money. So,
Right.
for example, something very different that would fall out of a rational periodization, a logical periodization attempt for bodybuilding. Let's just take a look at that second concern of periodization, the concern that says we're going to try to minimize injury risk. Fine. Well, let's see what unique minimization of injury risk bodybuilding offers. Well, we know that when we get closer to a contest, for example, last 3 4 weeks, fatigue is so unbelievably high and body fat so low that you even have a mild breakdown in motor pattern execution. So you're actually less athletic towards the end of a bodybuilding prep. Like you're prone to move in ways that your body shouldn't be moving, and thus we could say it's probably pretty logical in the last several weeks of your bodybuilding periodization for pre-contest to concern yourself with that and to maybe choose movements that have fewer degrees of freedom, that are less likely to get you hurt, even at the expense of their adaptive potential, because by then, you're not really building much muscle. You just need to hold on to it. So maybe
Totally.
you could theorize that slightly higher repetition ranges or slightly more machine movements, movements with less external loading and potential for instability. Like if you watch someone do a heavy triple right before powerlifting meet 2 weeks before, you'd be like, well, that makes a lot of sense. If you watch someone do a heavy triple 2 weeks before bodybuilding show, you'd be like, what are you stupid or something, right? And so concerns like that have to inform periodization. And here's another concern that informs periodization for bodybuilding. Let's say I'm after post contest, I'm done after the show, and I'm training again, but now I'm eating food for real, and my strength is going up crazy fast because of fatigue is dropping. I have food for the first time ever, so I'm getting good sleep. You know how it feels. Like after being lean for a while, you start to put on some weight again, and you're like fucking Superman. Well,
Totally.
the problem there again is that you can get really, really strong really fast and hurt yourself if you're not pacing yourself and realizing, like, look, even though I have much more energy, I have to make sure to slowly put the weight back on the bar because I know that connective tissues, for example, take longer to adapt than muscular tissues. And then I have to slow the rate of increase in load on volume, for example, at the very least to allow my connective tissues some decent time to adapt. It's like if you take a like an old classic muscle car out of the garage for the first time since 1972, maybe flooring it's not a good idea. It could blow up for all you know. So it's kind of stuff like that. And so this is to answer a theoretical question of do we need periodization for bodybuilding, which people ask out loud and is a fine question to ask out loud. And the answer is, well, we see all these declivities and proclivities in the structure of what we need for bodybuilding. We know we're going to be getting weaker here or more injury risky. We know we have to ease in here. We know here is the best time to make the highest volume incursions in our program because our food is really high. We know that during the maintenance phase, it's pointless to do really high volumes because there's not enough food coming in to even justify it. It's like picking up a racing hobby when gas is like 10 times more expensive or so. You like let's
Right,
other
right.
hobbies. Let's put the racing hobby on the back burner for now. So once you realize there's all these sort of asymmetries, you go, wow, actually there is a logical structure to lay over that landscape to make everything go as good as possible. So by conclusion, just on logical necessity, there has to be a periodization for bodybuilding is optimal. A quick analogy for that is, let's say your job was to walk into a room, like a party, maybe a conference, full of people, and try to make as many friends as possible, just to make a good impression. It does really depend on who those people are. Your strategy will change. For example, if it's an organization of a meeting of deaf society, people that can't hear, you're going to have to do some things differently. Or people that are interested in physics, or people that are interested in witchcraft, you're going to have to talk to people differently. So imagine someone saying, as a high school student who is a very charming just genetically and talks to pretty much everyone, and he's really popular. He could say something like, well, there's no real formal approach to any different kinds of rooms of people. I just go in as my same person. I just do the same thing I always do, and it always works. Well, it always works if you
Right.
talk to a high school student, stupid asshole, and you never had any money on the line. Like, let's say at the game show, you have to like try to make as many people impressed as possible. You're going to want to know who's in the room, and there's going to be a structure to how to
Yeah.
talk to people. So the same thing for bodybuilding is, I think there are lots of people trying to minimize the role of periodization in bodybuilding and saying things like, you just train to put on muscle. Like, that's true. What happens when you get tired? What do you mean? You take a break? Like, yeah, that's called something in periodization. And there are predictable times you get more tired in bodybuilding versus not tired. Like, for example, some people don't even consider how they're going to do their nutrition on their deloads during the pre-competition phase, the pre-contest phase. So how do you eat during deloads? And some people will be like, I don't take deloads. Like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Nuts? Like, and the answer is, you're just doing things really, really poorly and getting away with it for some other reason, or you just have a poor result that you think is a good result because you've never done anything differently. So yes, there absolutely is a periodization bodybuilding. I can lay out some of the basic foundations that you'll have in common
Totally.
for a lot of bodybuilding prep. But what I will say is, at the end of the day, periodization unfolds out of the requirements and constraints specifically in the needs analysis of that athlete. So it could look a little bit different from athlete to athlete to athlete, but it's always logical. At the end, when you build a good periodization protocol for something, you can point to it and say, this January 1st to January 7th, what are we doing here and why? And whoever wrote it should be like, we're doing this because of this and this and this. And it should make a lot of sense. If it doesn't at least make sense on the face value, it had better make a lot more sense when you intricately describe it. And if that doesn't happen, then you're just making stuff up.
Totally. And I have a counterpoint for the people that are prepping that shouldn't be doing 2 RMs and stuff like that. I don't know, Dr. Mike, if you recall a certain somebody called Coleman, I think. Ronnie? Is it Ronnie Coleman?
I've heard of the guy.
You know, yeah, some aficionado, I think. And I think we have that sort of thinking that most bodybuilders, well, we get exposed to that sort of information, to that sort of content that you see Ronnie Coleman doing 800 pounds in a squat couple of weeks prior a contest. Okay, you get exposed to that idea, and then on the other side, on the let's say science side, you have studies that found meta-analysis that found practically no difference between periodized training or non-periodized training for hypertrophy. But I think one of the really important caveats of those studies is that most of them are studies that are programs that are designed to increase 1 RM strength, but happen to analyze or to take into account hypertrophy. They're not. I don't know if I'm speaking my ideas clearly. This topic is a
Very.
little bit hard
No,
to
very.
translate in my head.
Yeah, yeah. No,
So
so,
so that
yeah.
that's the sorry to interrupt. That these studies are not specifically for hypertrophy, but they analyze hypertrophy. And then on the side of bodybuilders per se, you have people like, let's say, Ronnie Coleman that did that sort of stuff, but also maybe intentionally or not, also did periodization by taking weeks off, months off after a contest. So I think that's one of at least in my thinking, one of the reasons of this confusion that, oh, it doesn't matter, just train hard, or, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, sure. So there are many reasons to take studies about periodization with a grain of salt. And one of them is that they're mostly done on untrained or very recreationally trained people, what they're
Yeah.
called. Um, uh, Another one is mostly not done on actual bodybuilders who do the kind of manipulations in their training that bodybuilders do. So it's not even a real world test of bodybuilding periodization. It'll just be like one concept at a time. Another problem is those studies are generally way too short, such that periodization in bodybuilding really pays good dividends on the levels of months and years, and the studies are usually weeks. or a few months. So a lot of times we just don't get a lot out of the study that we could have. And what we have to do to build bodybuilding periodization that's rational is, of course, try it ourselves when we're in the bodybuilding mix and try it on bodybuilding clients and see what works and observe what kinds of needs and requirements we have. And in addition is just learn training science from a bunch of the studies combined on all sorts of different populations and try to come up with a set of dependable principles that can transfer between athletes. So for example, there's been numerous studies now that show that if you take a little bit of time off or lighter during the middle of your training, you get stronger and you get better at everything. You don't get any worse and you don't lose any muscle. So we have this like magic tool by which we can just reduce fatigue if we just take it easy for a few days. Can we think of any instances in bodybuilding which we'd want to use that? Oh my God, of course we could. So we start using it in bodybuilding where it is rational. And that doesn't matter if there's no study that ever formally examined, can we use deloads in the sport of bodybuilding? We know that they work in every other sport. We know the physiology of how they work. And we know that if we try them privately to ourselves or our clients in bodybuilding, they work in an obvious way that makes tons of sense. So there I would say, okay, those strategically timed deloads are important in bodybuilding periodization. And there's another thing here where there are so few studies in bodybuilding periodization, and never mind that they're not such great studies, not to the detriment of the people studying them. It's just a limitation of how much we have breadth over as far as research. 16 weeks is a really long time for a research study in a university setting. So those guys are doing their best. It just happens the best isn't that informative. It's important to remember that if we just collect the small amount of data that is available, and we know in the back of our heads that the data we're collecting is a tiny fraction of the real world stuff that's going on, we cannot be allowed to pretend that the data is very explanatory and that everything else, as far as anecdote or as far as better than anecdote, reliably observed observations about bodybuilders made by themselves and others for years and years and years.
True.
And physiological underpinnings, we can't pretend that that stuff doesn't matter at all, and that the only thing that matters is the tiny amount of published, not so well done literature in bodybuilding. The focus on collectible, actual data, and at the expense of every other sort of insight informationally, is a formal logical fallacy, or rather informal logical fallacy. That's a philosophical question of what that is. There is an official logical fallacy called the Mcnamara Fallacy. Comes from Vietnam general reference. There's a General McNamara that led U.S. forces and thought a little bit about these kinds of things and made this fallacy, so it was named after him. But basically, it was the Vietnam War, and there was all sorts of ways to get intelligence. And some of them were just like, hey, agents on the ground are saying the Viet Cong is going to do X, Y, Z. And the other forms were, well, we count the number of fires that there are in the forest to try to estimate how many Viet Cong there are through, observational imaging. And then we have actual data. Like, we put numbers to it. You can't put numbers to a CIA field report of a guy just telling you stuff is going to happen. So McNamara and the folks around him chose to really lean into formal numbers, even though there were very, very few of them and very non-descriptive. And they basically sort of did this thing where they pretended that the formal numbers on a situation was everything that could be known about a situation, and that if it wasn't formalized, they just weren't even going to take it into account. And so they lost an inordinate number of troops and mission objectives just pretending that they knew stuff when they didn't actually know stuff. And they said, well, we've got the data. Well, it's not the data. It's a tiny fraction of the data, and you're ignoring everything that's pretty obvious. It's kind of like you get a forecast on your cell phone, and it says, it's sunny, it's going to be sunny, and you look at this giant fucking storm cloud that's already raining 200 meters in front of you. It's coming this way, and your friends are like, should we go inside? You're like, no. The app says it's got data, it's got the degrees, and it's got all this. It says we don't need to be inside. It's like, oh, but the app could be wrong. But no. So a lot of times people do this thing where they do the PubMed Warrior thing, where they go and they find the 2.5 studies on bodybuilding periodization, and they say, see, it doesn't work. And when you have 2.5 studies on something outside of its actual scope of how you study it, I wouldn't go running and saying like, wow, this is the definitive work on the subject. And especially wouldn't go running on it for the following reason. Anybody intelligent who has attempted to bodybuild in an organized way personally feels the pushes and pulls of these opportunities and these restrictions in their bodybuilding training. If you told someone, look, like the research on deloading is not very convincing. There's just not that much of it. and I don't think you should deload. After a while, they just get very tired, and they say, "What do I do?" And you're like, "Well, just keep training hard," and then they won't be able to, and you go like, "Okay,
Right.
what the fuck am I doing wrong here?" Well, maybe you could try deload. You try it and it works unbelievably well, and then your friend says, "Well, there's not really any evidence for that." There's another problem there. We run into another fallacy that's very related to Mcnamara fallacy. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So because there's no evidence for there's no evidence to contradict many of the periodization practices of bodybuilding, but there may be no evidence to support it. And people say, well, there's no evidence for this. And I go, okay. So it doesn't happen. Like, no, that's actually a fallacy. Just because there's, no evidence. I look around, I don't see any B-2 stealth bombers right here in my room. Well, there must not exist a B-2 stealth bomber. Oh, what?
Sure hope not.
Right. Well, it's around. I've seen it before in another context with my own two eyes, and so it's fucking there. Just a very, very
Right.
bad job of evidence collection. So it's very important that as mature, and this is actually violates the definition of evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice is defined as the integration of published data, inference from physiological and anatomical understandings, and experience both coaching other people and as a personal and yourself in integrating all of that in the best understanding you can have of the state of training science today. So it requires all three of them. You don't take just one and say, well, that's it, right? So we have to be very careful about quote unquote studies on periodization. They are very, very limited. And if they are in opposition, or if the conclusions we draw from them are in opposition to every single available kind of type of evidence, and it makes no sense physiologically and anatomically. For example, some of the studies, you look at them, and if you squint hard enough, you can say, well, it looks like fatigue doesn't really accumulate. Are you going to be the person to die on that hill? Are you going to say in training, for real, fatigue doesn't accumulate? Can you imagine being like, week 5 of training really hard, people are like, how are you feeling? You're like, I feel amazing. Like, nobody's ever said that. So we can
Right.
we can be more reasonable than pure formal research allows by opening our eyes to the other, stuff that's going on. Funny enough, you could say when Tesla or whoever makes the first really good self-driving car, you could say, well, where are the university PubMed studies to support that the car is self-driving? Like, what's actually just
Right.
internal
Right.
research? The car fucking goes where it needs to, motherfucker. And it doesn't mean you need to be a publication about it. So we have to be very careful in knowing how to combine all types of evidence, and then we get an understanding that, yeah, there is this thing called bodybuilding periodization, and it's just made of reasonable assumptions about how things work.
Totally, because it's pretty unlikely that some of this stuff it's not gonna be studied directly, right? Like let's say a whole year of training, 6 months of training, because it's really hard to do so and to measure it and mostly have a context for all that stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough. And also, what about populations? I mean, almost all studies are
Also,
university studies. They usually get university students, regular people who go to college, because it's called a convenience sample. They're just around, and they're in your class, and you can say, "Hey, do you want extra credit?" And they go, "Yeah." You go, do the study, and they're like, "Okay." You pay them $200 or something, and they do the study. But they're not going to Dragon's Lair in Las Vegas. They're not going to the best gyms in Mexico City and recruiting actual bodybuilders to do the training, because a lot of times they have their own situation they have to do. Like, you can't go and recruit the top 10 Olympic sprinters in the world because they have their own training. They're going to do your stupid fucking training for your study. Um,
right.
so the amount of impetus we have with them is limited. I will say the survey research can be very helpful, and they do a little bit of that where you just go and ask bodybuilders what they do in real life. And some of the bodybuilders, and what I would like to see done, actually, this would be a really trippy research study, is give bodybuilders a short IQ test, just a very basic IQ test, and then have them talk about their periodization strategies and see if you can. What do the smarter ones do? That should be a very interesting study. But you can sort of do a study like this in your own time if you train at a gym with a lot of bodybuilders, or if, like myself and Jared and Charlie, you're in the industry and you talk to lots of them, and you see tons and tons of them, you train lots of them. After a while, you realize that the smarter bodybuilders, they have a pretty interesting structure that they all kind of settle on as being a real good idea. Of course, there's some debate between them, but a lot of
Right.
stuff you just don't debate. Like, if you take most of the smarter bodybuilders in the industry today and you watch them, you have them watch a guy who's doing heavy triples 3 weeks before a bodybuilding show, pretty much all of them, to a person, will look around and be like, that guy's a fucking idiot. And there's just not a lot of debate about, because if someone said, well, Ronnie did it, that's okay. there's so much other stuff to say about how bad of an idea that is. There's so many layers of why that's a bad idea. And then there's just so obvious that it's kind of like, you really, really sure this is a good idea? And after a while, the answer is no. So you can try to live in ignorance and say, well, because there are no meta-analyses on this, anything goes in bodybuilding. You can believe that privately, but if you say that publicly to people, you may be steering them away from informal information that could really, really help them. You know what I mean?
Totally.
That's that.
Because that's what it seems like for hypertrophy. Rep ranges, they don't matter as long as you do sufficient volume, sufficient proximity to failure. Periodization for hypertrophy, it doesn't matter,
Pause, because even right there, and I know you're being sarcastic, but even right there, we can get something going. So, for example, there's a famous study where they did like more or less like 7 sets of 3 versus 3 sets of 10, and it was almost exactly the same volumes. Older Schoenfeld study from a few years back. And if you read just the abstract, it says that the study that did 7 sets of 3 reps versus 3 sets of 10, they got the same muscular size accretion, but they got stronger because they're doing mostly triples. And I literally saw people parade that study around and say, look how it's how much better sets of 3 are. We should just do that because we get the strength and the size, and that's a good idea. Everyone should do that. And then if you actually read the study in the discussion section, the authors mentioned that the people that did 3 sets of 10, at the end of the study, they felt amazing. And they were like, hey, do you think you could just keep going? They're like, hell yeah, I've got months more of this shit in me. The people who did 7 sets of 3 were like breaking into pieces. They were like, my joints hurt. I don't know which way is up or down. I can't continue to do this. As soon as the study's over, I'm just not training much for a while. That is an important piece of insight that was not even in the abstract. And you could just be totally, and if you talk to the researchers themselves, which is very ethical, Brad Schoenfeld will tell you, like, yeah, these guys were like beat to shit, and that's absolutely not a sustainable way to train. We were even not even trying to examine that because most of us knew it would be an unsustainable way to train. We're just trying to get into theoretical mechanisms of, is there a benefit to going heavy? So the other way to interpret that study, now that we know that people got really beat up, is if we do 3 sets of 10 instead of 7 sets of 3, we're going to get the same muscle growth, but the fatigue is going to be way, way less. Well, fuck, that's the real insight, is you shouldn't be doing 7 sets of 3 if you're into hypertrophy training, because for a minimum fraction of that effort, you could be getting the same hypertrophy with 3 sets of 10. So already taking research studies by themselves and doing this, it doesn't matter stuff, takes a look only at the primary outcomes of the research study and not at the other outcomes. For example, if I told you, hey, listen, you want a fast car? I have a car that goes 320 miles an hour. You'd be really fucking stupid to just buy it off of me, because I forgot to mention it's a top fuel dragster. It doesn't even take regular gasoline. It's not street legal. You can't drive it on any turns. It's just a straight line vehicle. You're going to be like, oh my God, this car's not even a car. It's just like something you have as a rich guy when you want to race dragsters. I'm not going to take that to the shopping mall or to school. Well, I forgot to mention that. So, but if you ask people who only read abstracts, you say, hey, what kind of car should I get? They're like, dragster's the fastest. Like, okay, great, purchase. So there's the other stuff about training matters. It matters a lot. And it matters a lot for periodization, because periodization is an attempt to integrate everything. You're not worried about just adaptation or just fatigue. You're worried about both, and how they fit into that plan is really important. And as you get to be a better and better athlete, and as you get closer and closer to your peak genetic abilities, your margin of error starts to shrink, and the complexity and nuance of your plan has to become higher, because you're working with razor thin margins essentially to try to get a little bit more performance out of the system, a now relatively fragile system. People will say it doesn't matter for hypertrophy of the quads if you lift free weights, let's say squats for sets of 5, or if you do leg presses for sets of 15. And for untrained undergraduates in an 8-week study, that's absolutely true. But again, coming back to the question of what else is true, well, it turns out those undergraduates are squatting like 50 to 60 kilos, and they're leg pressing 80 to 100 kilos. And at those loads, with their fresh little young joints that don't have any lifetime history of abuse, doesn't matter. That's all the same. They're just not strong enough to hurt themselves.
Right.
Now, you tell a competition bodybuilder, you go do sets of 5s for the squat as a first exercise. You're like, what the fuck? Am I supposed to squat 600 pounds? And 600 pounds is not something, and people also say you should train legs hard twice a week. So if you get a PubMed warrior to write a bodybuilding program for a pro, it might be like 5 sets of 5 at 600 pounds on Monday, 5 sets of 5 at 605 pounds on Thursday. Next Monday, 5 sets of 5 at 610 pounds, and so on and so forth. You'd be like, this is going to kill somebody within 2.5 weeks, maybe, if they make it out of the second week at all. Their joints are going to get to dust. Their back is going to hurt. Their systemic fatigue, axial fatigue is going to be insane. They're not going to be able to bent over row because their back is going to be still hurt or still sore. And you say, oh, fuck, I should have considered that this is now a pretty intricate system. And maybe the leg press sets of 15, oh, wow, that actually accomplishes all the same hypertrophy for the quads, but at some fraction of the axial loading, some fraction of the systemic fatigue, some fraction of the injury risk. As all these other factors come together and, oh, okay, there are rules to how you should program for bodybuilders, and there are rules for how you should periodize the situation. So it's up to us to take all of our understanding, including our experiential understanding, and from that synthesize an attempt at what bodybuilding periodization should look like, as opposed to just looking at formally published studies with huge external validity problems and even huge ecological validity problems, because you're not training these folks like they would be in real life.
Because I think periodization ends up being like a no-brainer, really. Like not the question of is it necessary, do I need to do it? It's a part of your training. It's training itself, like you said at the beginning. And I think the concepts that are key are like periodic deloads that can be considered periodized, phasic changes in stress, let's say reps in reserve, let's say volume, let's say load, and the benefit is in the big picture, like you said, but also taking into account the training status. And maybe for beginners, they're squatting 60 kilos. Well, you don't need to worry too much about that. But in intermediates, in advanced people, it gets more and more, let's say, intricate. Not necessarily, but probably, and more necessary. Do you think it's a good assumption after all that we've been talking about?
100%. I would also say that there is a pretty clearly defined periodization even for beginners, but it has to depend on what question you're asking about how to train beginners. Is your question about what in a training study will have the same effect on paper as far as main outcome effect? Or is your question, what is the maximum effort we can put into both supplying a beginner current gains, the best possible base for future gains on which to make future gains, the minimization of injury as much as possible, and also the maximization of the probability that they will not quit training and will continue to show up for training. So, for example, you could say, look, if you split up training to 6 times a week, smaller sessions, versus 3 times a week, slightly longer sessions, people get basically the same result. So if someone wants to train 6 times a week as a beginner, or if you just want to train someone 6 times a week, it's just as good, it's just as okay as training them 3 times a week. Now, hold on a second. What is the state of the literature on the probability of people just quitting something they start new, if it's very, very intense, versus if it's like pretty leisurely? Well, the very intense stuff, they drop out like flies. Whereas something is challenging, but very much within their realm of ability, they're not as likely to quit. So if you say, well, should we train this beginner 3 times a week or 6 times a week? Of course, fucking 3. Who the fuck starts a hobby and just starts going 6 times? What kind of fucking crazy asshole do you have to be? Just change your life around and go 6 times a week. Like, that happens. People fall in love, with something.
Happens a lot, man. Happens a lot. People that starting out, they want to go 6, 7 days a week.
Yes, and what fraction of those people burn out because they made the mistake of going half, right? And so what we have to do is give our best understanding. And thus we say, okay, beginners should probably train just as many times per week as they feel a little bit challenged with. And it's going to be different person to person, but not so much that they feel overwhelmed. Okay, that's not really a consideration for a professional bodybuilder. Who the fuck asked that asshole if he's going to be overwhelmed? Shut the fuck up. The Olympia's coming up. The whole thing is already overwhelming. You know what I mean? Like, you're taking drugs, you're 120 kilos. It's over. It's all already overwhelming. And you're such a hardened soldier by then that it doesn't fucking matter. Someone's like, you have to train 8 times a week. Okay. I don't give a fuck. Like, I'm all in at that point anyway, right? So for beginners, there is other periodization concerns. Here's another one. People will say, this is something you may have heard relatively commonly, Beginners should be trained to failure so they know how failure training feels, so they can go there themselves. Stupid idea. It borders on being obviously objectively wrong if you've ever trained beginners before, been a beginner before. That's at least subtly wrong for the following reason. Beginners don't need to train to failure in order to get their best gains. They can train at like 5 reps in reserve and get identical gains. Okay. And if we want to, is it true that we want people to know how to train to failure by themselves? Yes, it's a good thing to have. However, an important thing to have also is for people to have good technique, right? Good technique is ultra important. There's a problem. If you don't have a very settled in good technique that's not automatic yet to you, it's not intrinsic, it's not like someone says squat and you're like, oh, I know what that is, and you automatically do it pretty well. Until you have that, if you try to train really, really hard, like go into failure, your technique breaks down. And it's actually impossible to undergo good technique learning while in a high stress environment. It just doesn't work. It's too much shit at the same time. So if we say we have to take people in their first year of training and teach them how to fail, what we are saying is we shouldn't teach them technique because both can't be done well at the same time. Now, which one's more important? Well, if we don't actually need to go to failure as beginners to see our best gains, for sure we can say it's not important to fail in the near term. It must be a skill we're learning for later. Okay. What about technique? Do they need good technique to make gains as beginners? No, they can do terrible technique and make great gains. But is technique something we learn that maximizes our abilities in the long run? Oh my God, for sure. So let's ask the next question, next order of thinking. Is it important for us to have a good technique base first? Or is it important for us to be able to go to failure and still grind through first? Is there a sequential order to that situation? It's the same question as asking, if I'm making a hamburger, do I put the bun down first or the fucking beef down first? There's an order to that shit. Makes actual sense. You don't grab the beef, you grab the fucking bun, so you don't want to grab the actual beef. So there's an order, and the order with technique and failure is super obvious. First, you master good technique, and that increases your stimulus to fatigue ratio like crazy. And then once you have demonstrated that you're able to do good technique under heavy loads and it doesn't break down, we slowly inch you closer and closer to failure, preserving that good technique. And then you learn at the end of that process as an intermediate to push hard as fuck with good technique. That is the ultimate victory. Now you're starting to have a really the basis for what we need an advanced athlete to have. And an advanced bodybuilder would also be able to have a good mind-muscle connection while pushing hard. Because, you've trained with lots of people before. You get someone even with good technique going hard on the leg press for high reps. They're yelling, they're screaming. They're doing good full range of motion and everything, but they're going hard as fuck up here, real close to failure. If they're an intermediate, you say like, hey, did you feel that in your quads? They're going to be like, I don't know, man. I had like kind of like a psychological episode. I don't know where I felt it. That's not what they're paying attention to. But if you don't know good technique, and if you don't even know how to push hard, how the fuck are you supposed to work on your mind-muscle connection? You can't. So there's a sequence there. First you learn technique, then you learn how to train really hard, and then you learn how to be aware of your body so that you can really fine-tune that process. And it has to happen in those 3 ways, because if you mix the sequence up, then you're doing things first that are a really bad idea to do first that destroy other qualities after. So when people say, periodization is not important for beginners, can you run a research study without measuring how many people are left over afterwards and how many people you've built with good habits that equates to very different approaches with the same proximate short-term results? Yeah. Is it good for their long-term? Equally good? No. If you have beginners you're training for the long term, there is a periodized, very specific way you should be able to train beginners. Evidence for this fact is the major athletic organizations of most of the developed countries, they have long-term athlete development protocols for every sport of how you should take athletes when they're just starting out, how you should train them. It's very detailed, even from the very first day of gymnastics practice. It's not just, we'll get them going and it's all the same until they get to be advanced. It's not all the same. So it's not all the same even with bodybuilding. And people tend to forget that because they're misunderstanding the nature of the data. Just because you see 3 fighter planes that all can go Mach 2, 2 times the speed of sound, that doesn't mean they're all the same fighter plane. that means that they can go, top speed is the same, but there are other qualities. There's how fast can you go for how long? There's what kind of missiles do you have? What kind of radar do you have? How well integrated are you into the informational system of your military? You're just like flying one dude in a fucking cockpit and you have no idea where you're going. Those are also very important things. And if you consider all of them, it looks like fighting a war has very specific technical qualities and very specific instructions as to how you're supposed to do it. For lack of political correctness, this is currently being illustrated as Russia versus Ukraine. Russia has a war-fighting doctrine that is just outdated. It's just wrong. And the Western militaries who are helping out Ukraine and always giving them intel and recommendations, they have a very well-developed, dare I say, scientific approach to fighting war. And look what's happening. Ukraine's like a tenth as strong as Russia, or was at least when they started fighting the war. And Russia's fucking losing with all their might. So shit matters, even at the very low level, even at the beginner level. And if you're equating on just one thing at a time, it's not a very open eye view of the world. Sorry for ranting on that for so long.
No. Thanks for that. It's really comprehensive. I think it gives a clearer idea of what periodization actually is, and it's not only for the advanced. Maybe I put it that way before your participation.
A lot of people do, though.
Yeah, because it's kind of confusing. Let's just say the list just by the terms periodization, programming, phase potentiation. That we need to start by the beginning by understanding what is a microcycle, a mesocycle, a block, blah blah blah. And then, like you put it, it's a necessity. It's part of training, and it's not like just advanced people need to take fatigue management as a means of periodization.
Yeah.
It's that a necessity.
Can you?
But
imagine...
I wanted to.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Can you imagine someone saying they get a laptop for the first time, and you open it up, and they're like, Windows comes up or Microsoft Excel, and they go, "Oh, I don't use computer programs. I'm not a programmer." They're like, no, computer programs are for everyone. You just use different programs when you get more advanced. And, watch this. iTunes. Really easy to use iTunes. Just click on the song, type in the song you want, click, and that's it. It plays. Right? So because, when you use a computer, everyone uses computer programs. It doesn't matter, beginner, intermediate, whatever. Everyone in the gym uses a gym program and a gym periodization idea. They may not even be that aware of it. One thing I'll say really quick is, if people listen to this and go, fuck, there's a goddamn periodization for beginners, Jesus Christ, like, how fucking complicated these idiot nerds going to make it. And the reality is, like, you can make it as complicated as you like/want. You can open up new layers of complexity to your own desire and to your needs. So, for example, if you're doing good technique and you're training pretty fucking hard and you're not overdoing it, you're only training 4 times a week, and you just never felt like you needed a week of rest, don't fucking take it. It's okay. You're getting good results. You're good. As long as you're doing the basics okay, it's fine. But then when you get into the situation of, wow, my joints are really beat up, I really don't feel like training anymore, I just feel super tired, I haven't been getting any stronger, you look back through one of the blog posts that let's say they follow you and they see you something on deload, they scroll back and they go, fuck me, all right, I'll try that. And they try it and it works. And then from then on, they're a person that does regular training, no overthinking, stupid mama jumbo, plus deloads. And then their friends are like, I noticed you deload, like, why? And they're like, this one time I got really tired. And then the deload, it really, really helped me. So at the end of the day, anything we do in bodybuilding periodization doesn't require very extensive answers. It requires the answer of, like, well, there's just one simple reason that's probably why you're doing it. And they go, holy shit, that actually makes a lot of sense. Like, why do we lift lighter before contest? Because you get really hurt and really fatigued lifting heavier. Next question. They're like, oh, wow, it's not that complicated. No, it's not that complicated. Totally. Any level of analysis, it gets a little bit more complicated if you take a few of those and connect them. But really, that's not that hard anyway. So.
Yeah, I remember a friend that was feeling like dragging to the gym, a little tired, classic. And I just said, no, take a deload. This is what a deload looks like. Maybe try this. Try reducing your training load by half. Really simple stuff.
Yeah.
And it worked like a charm. And well, it's not that complicated, right?
No.
Like you said. But I wanted to ask you, Dr. Mike, about some specific variables. And what is your opinion? Is it worth varying to enhance hypertrophy? And one of those is fiber type specific hypertrophy, that we can vary or rep ranges of loading zones for specific fiber type hypertrophy. Because I know the research is the middle ground? Like some find a benefit, some don't. What is your opinion on that?
It's a very good question.
Maybe to put it simply, is it worth it by your reading of the literature to vary in loading zones?
That's a very different question. I'm glad you re-asked it in that way. So this can allow me to wax nerd-like about what the distinction is there.
Oh, please go ahead.
All right, that's why I'm on
I'm all ears.
it. Yeah, it is funny though when they get me on podcasts. They're like, "Can you keep it simple?" I'm like, "You guys get the wrong guy for that." Sure.
Yeah.
So the question of whether to manipulate training variables in order to specifically target various fiber types versus others
Yeah.
is very different than the question of are there other good reasons to alter training that look a lot like you're doing fiber type specific training but actually aren't targeting the fiber types at all. Or actually, you could say these training modifications are agnostic to whether or not fiber types can be differentially targeted to begin with. For example, we could have a situation in which we say, you should eat your food during the day and you should sleep at night. We could ask, well, so is there something wrong with digestion at night? Is there something wrong that people, if they eat in the middle of the night, the food won't become anabolic? And you can say yes and claim that there's something special about nighttime diurnal stuff and digestion. And maybe that's true, maybe that's not. What you also say is, when people are asleep, they usually like to stay asleep, and sleep's so good for you that once you're asleep, it's probably not a good idea to bother you. Just because you're asleep at night, it's already a good use of your time. You should move everything else, like eating, to outside of night because it's so important to get sleep. You're not making any claims about that, it's eating during sleep is a bad idea. And as a matter of fact, somebody could ask you, what if I'm just awake at night? Should I eat? And someone could say, yeah, that's perfectly fine. Well, I thought you said it was a bad idea. No, I'm saying sleep is better than eating, so don't wake yourself up on purpose in order to eat. In very much the same way, we don't actually know current state of literature. We're not sure if fiber type specific training even works, is even possible, is even theoretically tenable. But what we do know is that if you train really, really heavy all the time, your joints take a beating. And if you train really, really light all the time, then your joints feel great, but at some point you start to burn out of the training because it hurts so goddamn much and it's so fucking boring and it's so annoying that you don't even want to be there anymore. So we also know that some muscle groups and some exercises for those muscle groups experientially seem to respond better or worse to various repetition ranges. For example, if a stiff-legged deadlift targeting the hamstrings is done in many people for more than 15 repetitions per set, many people will notice the forces are now insufficient, seemingly, to be really robust to train the hamstring in that deep stretch position, but the lower back starts to become such a limiting factor endurance-wise that it becomes a lower back lift instead of a hamstring lift. On the other hand, if you're doing sets of 5 or so leg curls for the hamstrings, the tension is so great that the concomitant volume is so small that the mind-muscle connection is off. It feels like total shit. You're like, am I ripping my hamstrings off my body? I don't even know what's going on. I mean, you can do lots of sets of 5 in the leg curl and not get any soreness, any reduction in strength, any pump. Nothing's happening as far as you can tell. So you can start to say, well, hamstring curls are probably better done with sets of 10 or above. And then hip hinges are probably done better with sets of 5 to 10. And for many people, that will be a correct answer, having nothing to do with fiber types whatsoever. So because fiber type training may not be the reason we alter loading ranges, does not mean it is the only reason. And there are like 5 other good reasons to alter loading ranges so that after a while, we have a program that alters loading ranges predictably and consistently and for a purpose, systematically, we could say. And that doesn't mean we have to nod to fiber types. So to answer the question very, very clearly, there's not enough evidence for us to even suspect that differential fiber type training is possible or something that happens. But there's lots of evidence that training in certain rep ranges in certain situations gives you seemingly a poor stimulus proxy and a poor fatigue proxy, and that training with other rep ranges in other situations or other rep ranges in those same situations can make the stimulus seem much bigger and the fatigue seem much lower. So I would say chasing the best stimulus to fatigue ratio can result in a program that absolutely alters or at least uses different rep ranges based on the situation, whereas we don't need to suspect that fiber type alterations are involved in that process.
Awesome, awesome. And do you think a good way to do this is meso after meso within a training block? Let's say you start meso one with lower rep ranges. Meso 2, you go a little bit up. Meso 3, you go a little bit up within a same block. And maybe you add a session within that block. And then after a couple of those blocks, you do maybe, how was this called? Active rest. You think this is a good way to put all of this together?
It can be, absolutely.
How do you like to approach this?
Yeah. So for example, something you could do is you can say, okay, I just did an active rest or maintenance phase. I'm really, really healed up. My
Right.
work capacity is relatively low because I'm pretty detrained. However, my anabolic sensitivity is very, very high. Very sensitive to volume because I've barely done anything for a while. And my joints feel amazing. I don't need much work to grow. I can't do a lot of work, even if I want to grow, because my work capacity sucks. My joints and connective tissues feel amazing. There are a few right answers to what I could do in that training, but one of them could be train pretty heavy, sets of 5 to 10, right? Makes perfect sense.
Right.
Because sets of 5 to 10 beat your ass. But like, if you don't need that many of them, it's totally fine. And my joints feel great anyway. Now let's fast forward 2 mesocycles later. What is the situation in which they're in? Mesocycle 3, not 1. Is it true to say that your joints feel amazing? No. They may feel okay, but they sure as hell don't feel amazing anymore. Sure. What is your minimum effective volume at this point? How many sets do you need for hypertrophy? More. You need more.
It's gonna be
up.
Sure.
And so you're in this position where you are excellent work capacity because you've been practicing doing high volume sets for so long now. So your work capacity is good enough to do more volume. You need more volume in order to grow more muscle. But the problem is your joints are no longer like, yay, let's go really heavy. So if you need lots of sets of something, if you make it a little bit lighter and joint friendly, sets of 15 instead of sets of 5, then all of a sudden you've listed every single one of those items and it fits perfectly into that plan. So the first mesocycle may be much lower volume, higher intensity. The third mesocycle might be much higher volume, much lower intensity. The second mesocycle may be an interpolation between the two, right? Something between the two. And all of a sudden you have a logical reason for structuring your training that way. And might I add this, you can still linearly increase the lift of choice the entire time. So for example, let's say we have 2 chest exercises per week in the first mesocycle, because it may actually just take that few in order to get you to grow. You can do them all with sets of 5 to 10. Next mesocycle, you may have 3 chest exercises in a week because you needed to add some volume. That new exercise that you add could be in the 10 to 20 rep range. The 2 you still have could still be in the 5 to 10 rep range. That doesn't mean we need to reduce the weight or take them out. They can still be there. But your whole body, systemic recovery, is able to add a new exercise. Your joints are not able to add a new heavy exercise. So you gotta say we add a light exercise. It's like if someone's already had 2 entrees at a restaurant, you say, do you want any more food? They're likely to say they want dessert more than, yeah, I'll take another entree. What the fuck is wrong with you? Jesus, really? Okay. Right? So there's always room for dessert. There's always able to do some higher rep sets because they don't hurt the joints, but it's not always possible to add a low rep set. Now we go to mesocycle 3. Now we need 4 chest exercises in that week. We can keep the 2 exercises of 5 to 10. And now we're training the heaviest we've ever been. But we can't say, well, let's do even more exercises of 5 to, holy fuck. So you may have that third from the mesocycle 2, that third exercise of 10 to 20 reps, and you may add a 4th exercise of 10 to 20 reps or even 20 to 30 reps. And you can say to yourself, well, look, I know that higher rep sets, 20 to 30, they get stale really fast. Like it's very easy to stop getting pumps and stop getting sore. And like you just can't keep adding those sets because they burn you out like crazy. The fatigue is crazy high. But for one mesocycle, they're really awesome to do. Perfect. You have the third mesocycle in which you do those, and then you do an active rest again and a maintenance phase again. You wash out all the fatigue and the volume resistance, and you come back and repeat the process. Is that the only way to periodize for training? No, there's tons of different ones that work very, very well. But I'm just getting people to view this from a logical perspective of what are my needs and what are my limitations. I'm going to train as much as I can for needs, thinking of this mesocycle, but also what am I going to do the next meso or the meso after that? And you have to think ahead in order to secure good outcomes, because you're not in this bodybuilding thing to maximize one mesocycle at a time. You're in this
Right.
to maximize the career, technically. Like, it's like if you're on a dating show and it's like compete with, make as many friends as possible and end up in a relationship and you win. If you start talking shit about everyone else behind everyone else's back on the first day, everyone will just think you're a piece of shit and you won't win anything. But if
Sure.
you wait till the very end, to the you get to decide who to go with, and then you talk shit, there may be a strategic reason and you win. But the talking shit poisons the well for later, which is kind of like the same analogy of like ultra high rep sets with ultra high volumes fatigue you so much and leave you so desensitized to hypertrophy that you may need a few weeks of easy training like an active rest in order to even come back. So that the realization there doesn't mean we should never do such training, but it should say that the most logical time to do that training is right before you get a chance to take a break. You don't want to come in
Totally.
first microcycle of meso 1 and say 10 sets to failure, let's do it. Each set 15 reps. Like, what the fuck is session
Totally.
2 going to look like? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Totally. And I like it because it takes into account pretty much every variable. It takes into account volume, takes into account rep ranges, and also exercise selection periodization. If you add some exercises, I think it takes care of itself pretty much and ends up, funny enough, being quite simple. Maybe in work, maybe in your program it's a little bit complicated, but I like that approach because at least for me it's much more clearer to view it like that with all the things you said. And the last thing I wanted to ask you that you mentioned, actually, if you have the time, of course,
I do.
signaling. Do we have any sort of evidence in regards to anabolic signaling and periodization?
Yes.
Because one thing is loading sounds good. What about signaling? I
Yeah.
know it's a little bit more nitty gritty, but
No,
it's
no.
quite interesting.
No, yeah. So there's a recent study. I think it was done by Brad Schoenfeld and his team. I don't think it's preprint right now, but the results have already been announced. And basically, what they found was they're looking at molecular signaling mechanisms and
Right.
anabolic machinery, and they're trying to see session to session to session how these signaling mechanisms are impacted, and also to see how long it takes for them to resensitize if they ever do. So it looked like after multiple sessions of repeated resistance training for the same muscle, there is attenuation in the anabolic signaling, which is news to everybody except for everyone who's trained with weights for longer than a few months. And this only took, I believe, a few weeks to become pronounced. And then after that, it took like a week and a half, so to speak, or so, depending on how you space it out, in order for the complete reduction of that decrease in sensitivity back to baseline. The really, really good thing we know is that in roughly that amount of time, most of the people probably didn't lose hardly any muscle at all. So we know that resensitization occurs on a different time scale than muscle loss. That's really good news, because that means we can train hard, end up gaining no muscle at the end, gain lots through the middle, take a break, we lose a little bit of muscle, but our propensity for becoming sensitive to training goes back up much faster. And then after a few weeks, we start training hard again, and we get a lot more meaningful gains, such that there's now a concordance between anabolic signaling and fatigue, so that during the time that we are reducing fatigue anyway, we can also be increasing anabolic signaling. Because if nothing at all, if fatigue had nothing to do with anabolic signaling, we would still have to reduce fatigue, because you just can't train hard when you're fucking tired. Even if under the hood all the molecular shit is like, I'm still ready to grow. If you can't produce an overload, you don't grow much, right?
Totally.
But it looks like there is a concordance whereby, while we're reducing fatigue anyway because we're too tired to train, if we train very little and we train very easy, the resensitization at a molecular level of those growth pathways also happens on, I'll say, seemingly similar time courses. But the time courses are not a day and they're not two. They're like a week or two. So my preliminary look on that very, very limited research is that 1 week of deload every 5 or 6 weeks can eliminate most of the anabolic sensitivity reduction, but not all of it. And it probably takes a 2 or 3 week period every now and again to reduce almost all of it down to, whatever accounts for your training status and genetics at that time. And that makes a very good case for an occasional active rest, does it not?
Yeah,
And
totally.
and it's not a case you have to make unless you've tried it before, because if you've ever tried an active rest, 2 weeks later, after I'm actually at the very beginning of my active rest right now. At the end of an active rest, you go in and at the beginning of it, at the end of your last mesocycle, you're doing curls. And it takes you like 4 sets of curls to feel anything at all, and 5 sets to get a pump. And you're like, all right, this is just a really big pain in the ass. You do 1 set of curls after active rest, and it feels like you've never trained, and your bicep instantly gets an enormous pump and starts to cramp on you, and you're like, holy fucking shit. And you think to yourself, what are my volume landmarks in the gym for when I say I've had a good enough workout? I'm pretty sure a violent pump and insane cramping is when I just leave the gym, because I've accomplished whatever the fuck it is I was over here for. And I know that if I do even more damage to the system, it would just be net negatives, no positives. And then you think to yourself, is it really possible that one working set is now as effective as 5 working sets used to be 3 weeks ago? Yes, the answer is yes, which is great, because now you can just do one working
Pretty
set
cool.
this week, 2 working sets next week, 3 the week after that. As the adaptation climbs, you put in a little bit more volume to that need. And so anabolic signaling hypothesis is looking very, very strong recently. And again, it looked strong to all of us that were actually paying attention for a long time, because we realized that after 2 weeks not being in the gym, we didn't really lose much muscle, but our freshness, the reduction of staleness in training, was enormous. It's like, man, there's something to it. The body has to be more sensitive to muscle growth after a while. And now we
Right.
have some very interesting direct confirmations in that literature. And here's another much more hopeful thing. Maybe just based on many more of these studies, we can get some time courses that are more reliable prescribed. So the studies could say, look, in all of the subjects we trained, full return to anabolic sensitivity occurred within 3 weeks. 90% of them were there for 2.5 weeks. 80% were there for 2 weeks. And then 50% after 1 week, etc. We could get a few studies to sort of illustrate that. And then we can make direct evidence-based recommendations on deload length or deload frequency. We could also find out how long it takes to smash down the anabolic responsiveness. I think for them, I'm going to get this wrong, but it was like 6 or 7 sessions or something like that.
In the Schoenfeld study that's not yet published?
Yeah, I think it was seven
Right.
seven exposures, and seven
Right.
exposures. If you train twice a week, 7 exposures is 3.5 weeks. Jeez, that's so fucking close to how long people say most people can train until they need a deload, like 4 or 5 weeks. Yeah, that's right there. Whenever I'm sure you hear people like 9 weeks and then I deload. You're like, get the fuck. What are you doing for 9 weeks that you can sustain 9 weeks without a deload, right? So it's one of those situations where the stars seem to be lining up. It makes a lot of sense, because what was research going to do? Contradict what people saw in the gym? That would be quite strange, wouldn't it? Can you imagine,
Right.
like, you're not getting barely any pumps after 5 sets of curls, and someone's like, nah, you should be growing the same. It doesn't matter. All right.
Some, something sketchy.
Something very sketchy, yes.
Very well. So, Dr. Mike, I don't want to take any more of your time. Thanks yet again for doing this, for taking the time. I always learn a ton from you, man. I just stare, trying to trying to get all of it. Then I watch it again and try to get more of it. So, thanks a lot for taking the time. I do hope you get better, Dr. Mike. Hope it's not COVID, because it's quite a bitch.
Maybe it's the last time anyone ever sees me on video. That'd be trippy, right?
It could be trippy, but I would have the privilege and the honor, right?
Which absolutely.
Always thinking about me. I'm sorry for that,
No,
Dr.
no,
Mike.
you're always thinking about the positives. It's good to think about the positives.
We try to, man. The world is not really that positive on itself, right?
Sometimes the world looks a little negative. Danielle, thank you so much, man. Thank you so much. And,
Thanks to you, man.
all right.
Anytime you want to come to Mexico, you're more than welcome.
Awesome.
Right?
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Take care, Dr. Mike.
Peace.
Have a
Bye-bye.
good day.
Bye-bye.
Gracias a todos. Thanks to everybody. Voy a estar dejando esta conversación grabada aquí guardada en mi perfil. La pueden revisar cuando gusten y posteriormente la subo a mi canal de YouTube. Take care, everybody.